It is indeed a privilege and an honor for me to welcome our speaker of the day, Dr. Joeeta Pal. Dr. Joeeta Pal is an assistant professor at Miranda House, University of Delhi. Her work revolves around the archaeology of death. She completed her PhD in 2020 from the Center of Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, with a specialization in the body in death in early Buddhism. Her MPhil thesis argued for the existence of multivalent death practices in the Indus Valley sites through an analysis of skeletal remains and burials at Kalibangan and Lothal. She has been a fellow of the Trans-Regional Academy of the Forum for Trans-Regional Studien and the Max Weber Foundation on India and the World, New Arcs of Knowledge. Her interests include the personhood of skeletal remains, death practices, and memorialization. Dr. Pal is a published researcher who engages in both academic and public writing. Her outreach activities include a specially curated walk with the Harappa Gallery of the National Museum, New Delhi. Ma'am is also a member of the Collective for Radical Death Studies. On behalf of Raahi, the Heritage Walk Society Miranda House, I extend a very warm welcome to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, all of you. It's really quite a privilege to be welcomed to this particular forum. So I'd like to start by extending my thanks to the Raahi team, starting with Mumtaz's team last year when our conversations really had begun. I also want to thank all of you for the very jazzy multimedia bits that all of you have made. And that tells the audience that if you get bored, you know exactly who to blame for your misfortune. So we're going to try and keep this a little short because I've had the trauma of teaching you all for double lectures for quite some time. So we're going to try and keep this short, and that'll give us a lot more chance for discussion if we so choose. So yeah, so can I get started? Can I share my screen? All right, great. All right, I don't know if that's visible.
It's visible now.
It's visible. Okay, great. Well, all right, whilst it sets itself up. Right, so, okay, I need to figure out how to minimize this, but okay. So as you all can see, the title of the talk is the Inhabitants of Harappan Cemeteries. As you guys have already started, I'm going to also add on to certain housekeeping rules. So, okay, can you all still see the PowerPoint presentation, or can you see the word present? The PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
Yes, we can see the PowerPoint.
All right, excellent. Okay, so housekeeping. What we are going to be doing today is looking at many skeletons. We are going to be looking at many skeletal remains, all right? So maybe just little bits and pieces of bone as well. In several instances, we associate skeletal remains, skeletons with horror films. It's meant to induce fear, you know, maybe pleasurable fear, maybe complete terrifying fear. It also gives us a slight taste of voyeurism. You have tropes of morbid fascination, morbid curiosity. But I don't want all of us to be viewing skeletal remains in this way today. Through this webinar, I want us to recognize a dual privilege that we all have. We're able to see individuals, we're able to see people, not just skeletal remains. And I want us to go through the skeletal remains and get to the people that lie over there. We're also able to enter into a very profound moment of grief for people who have created these specific burials, all right? Burials, unlike other archaeological remains, don't just come up on their own, right? So we've had conversations in classes about how you have that house and slowly, because of the elements, it gets buried underneath, it crumbles into pieces. You have the archaeological record, the archaeological mound that is created. But this is not the case with burials. A burial is an intentional act. It is only going to exist because it has been created. So in the very least, it is a meaningful, intentional act of certain people. So when we are looking at skeletons, this is what we need to understand. Both the person buried and the people around who have created this burial. It's a personal act, it's a creative act, but at the same time, it is reflecting views of the community about life, about death, about everything in between. So we are really at a moment of privilege when we are looking at these skeletal remains, and I would like for us to enter with this sort of a perspective. All right, so when an archaeologist is looking at a burial as a whole, so skeleton plus some grave goods, if you're lucky, or maybe something really, really fancy, if you're extremely lucky, how do we start? Where do we go from there? The first thing you're probably going to ask is, how old was this individual when they died? What stage of life were they at? What sex did they belong to? How did they relate to this in terms of gender identity? What did the creators of the burial choose to place in the grave? Could we have called these people healthy? Could we have called them wealthy? How are they related to everyone else that you are finding in your cemetery region? And how did they die? So we have these many different questions that we get to ask. And as we approach different burials, we change our questions, we contextualize our questions for a particular burial. But two things should become quite clear from here. Firstly, we are dealing with a very complex mixture of the biological and the social, right? So we're not just interested in saying, okay, how old was this person when they died, but what did it mean to be that particular age? What does it mean to be a 2-year-old, a 20-year-old? Or even a 200-year-old person. And by that, I don't mean some sort of superhuman, super alien, popular culture science show kind of person. I mean the remains that we find buried in pots that are venerated by multiple generations thereafter. So we are looking at many different types of skeletal remains, and we know that there are different meanings ascribed to them. But in the end, our aging will be biological. It will be based in the natural sciences. So that's the first point we need to remember. We're looking at an intermingling of the biological and the social, of natural sciences and social sciences. And we need both of these things together to really understand the people that we're looking at. It doesn't really work if we focus on one and forget about the other. Secondly, whilst yes, we are studying the dead, our questions really dealt with their lives, right? It wasn't merely about how they died. What did they eat? What diseases did they have? Did they use their arms? Did they use their necks to carry very heavy loads? Were there some times in their lives when their bodies were so stressed that you see marks that are left on their bones? So we bring death in here, but we are not cleanly separating it from the lives that these people have lived. We are not cleanly separating it from the lives of the people who have buried them. So there is a very huge mixture of different factors when we are looking at one particular burial. So as you enter into all of these spaces and you see all the people we're going to meet today, do try and bring these questions in, and let's see how far we can answer those. Now, as mentioned in the program, we know that I am arguing that there is very great mortuary variability in the Harappan sites. So practices of death are not the same in all the Harappan sites. We see a massive amount of variation. And this is quite strange, right? Because if we think of Harappa, we think of standardized weights and measures. We think of seals. We think of the Harappan script. We think of the perfect 90-degree roads and the nicely built houses. We think of this high level of standardization, and then it should and hopefully will shock all of you to see how different practices of death are being followed in the different sites. And this is really major, right? Because then we need to question, what part of data do we pay more attention to? Do we argue for commonalities based on standardization? Or do we say that practices of death, ideas, thinking is different in all the sites, and we need to analyze our data a little more sharply? So this is something that the study of death in Harappan sites should really bring to us. And a final little disclaimer before we start our discussion is that when we are looking at any cemetery, whether it is at Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Lothal, Kalibangan, wherever it is, or even the large one at Rakhigarhi that all of you would have read of in the news, we are looking at a very tiny fraction of people being buried. Let's remember, these sites are occupied for thousands of years. If we had a proper cemetery where everyone was buried, it would be enormous, right? You would have thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and yet we never find this evidence. So these are particular practices which particular people are engaging in. So again, we are not trying to sort of homogenize. We're not providing a generalized explanation for every single person that we're meeting on this site. On the other hand, there are certain commonalities that we have in themes. So this presentation essentially is going to, in that way, be thematic. We're going to be talking about 4 sites, and we just add Rakhigarhi at the end. And we're going to be bringing out the following themes. So when I talk about Harappa, I'm going to be talking about inequalities and marginalization. When I'm talking about Mohenjo-Daro, I'm going to be talking about the fascination of a massacre idea versus the reality that we get to see. When I speak about Lothal, I'm going to be asking about ritual and about ritual killing as opposed to natural death. And finally, when I come to Kalibangan, I'm going to be discussing disability and ways of dealing with disabilities. So we have different themes that are flowing through. There's somewhere connected, somewhere disconnected. And finally, with Rakhigarhi, we're going to be speaking about the afterlife of a particular individual when their burial is taken out of the land where it is and put into a museum. So this sort of fossilized afterlife of a person is what we're going to be dealing with. To begin with, a slight context of Harappa, though all of us have it pretty well down to pat. As you can see, it is a very large area that we are speaking of. It's perhaps only natural then that we speak of such great diversity in mortuary concerns. As far as the burials are concerned, we do have a certain number of commonalities. Again, we are most likely to find skeletal remains. Sometimes we don't. We are most likely to find some bare minimum objects, some bare grave goods in most of our burials. So these are the commonalities that we have between our sites. And then when we create our narratives, it goes into a different space altogether. So we're going to start off with Harappa. I'm going to be brief with Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro because they are not sites I have studied. They're sites we're looking at with reference to other people's work. And then when we come to Lothal and Kalibangan, I will be speaking more in detail since that deals with my work. So again, when we think about the Harappan civilization, we're thinking of a consistent, standardized form of within a vast territory. This includes the script, standardized weights and measures, sanitation systems, as well as subsistence systems, right? Standardized ways of getting food, as well as settlement planning, whether this is the large cities or the small villages into which this is disintegrating. And we then assume a certain form of symbolic and ideological homogeneity, or we could think of it as certain connections between different sites where ideas are being exchanged. Particularly for the site of Harappa, we know that it is one of the largest sites found. It is one of the most vastly excavated sites in that it's been excavated about 26 different times. In this particular space, we tend to find 3 areas where we get our data from. And it should be visible to all of you on the map that you can see. So you have areas where people are living. I hope all of you can see the map. Yes?
Yes, ma'am.
Excellent. Okay, you have areas where people are living. You have the proper cemetery 37. You have the proper cemetery H. And finally, you have an area which is called an ossuary, which is an extremely interesting sort of feature that we have. Now, scientists have been studying the bones that you find in each of these spaces. And there seem to be more or less very major similarities in terms of nutrition, in terms of diseases that you find in these different spaces. But then you suddenly see this little ossuary at the outskirts or towards the margins of the territory. And that is what brings in a very important point into our understanding of death practices in this area. So the ossuary is basically a space where the remains have just been placed together. They've not been placed the way you would place a body nicely within a grave. There are a bunch of bones which have been placed together, mainly skulls, a lot of long bones, things that are easy to find, things that survive. And along with that, you have some animal bones for some reason, not too much, but a certain number of animal bones. We normally interpret it as remains of a meal, maybe something that was given to eat in the afterlife. But again, that's very, very hypothetical. That's just one of the ways in which we can look at it. There are also some grave goods that you find. So some pottery in the form of goblets, in the form of vases, in the form of dishes. So it's a very interesting sort of space where you're not finding individual graves with individual people, but you're finding a collection of bones with some sort of offerings made to it. So again, fits our definition, right? It's an intentional burial of people. On analyzing the bones of these particular individuals, one thing that became very clear was patterns of social inequality. The ways in which these people's remains are kept at the margins of the settlements tends to reflect their status in life. So overall, the nutrition that these people were receiving was quite a bit less. Their ability to get really, really bad infections that leave marks on the bones was also very high. And finally, the main point is that their exposure to violence was also much higher than we see with the different people buried in different parts of the cemetery. So again, over here, you see only a small portion, a small fragment of a bone, but you can see a pretty nasty mark on that, a pretty bad sort of cut mark. And we know that this individual died of this particular cut mark because there's no sign of healing. There's no way he recovered from it. His body, just his or her, I think it's his body, did not recover from it. You also have individuals like this, with these round little pits in the skull that I hope you can see, which indicate a very, very strong and virulent sort of infection. So even if it didn't kill the person immediately, it's likely to have shortened their life considerably. So this is then the very interesting sort of trope that we can apply to the site of Harappa itself. We know that there is a group which is in control as opposed to an individual, right? So we know that power is in the hands of a bunch of people. And then there are people like this who have suffered to a very large extent because of their lower station in society. So I'm sure all of you are aware of the really easy ways of telling status ki acha iske paas 5 pot hai, usko 20 pot mile, he is much better off in life. That really doesn't work. When we analyze bones, we have a much clearer understanding of how patterns of discrimination are working, and similarly of how some groups are much more vulnerable to violence than every other group in society. So the strongest indicators of inequality, therefore, are coming through your burial spaces, and particularly at Harappa. There's also another interesting fact which the authors of this paper have put in, and that is that with climate change, you see a sudden increase in the marginalization of these people, in the inequalities they face, the infections they get, and their propensity for violent death. And as we know, one of the reasons why Harappa seems to decline is because of the overexploitation of resources. It's no longer possible to live in the city, and perhaps that is why it is the marginalized who bear the brunt first, and then everybody slowly begins to abandon the city. So these are the sort of insights then that you are able to get from these small examples at Harappa. On the one hand, you got to know about this one person who died a violent death, or this other person who had a truly traumatic health experience, but it is telling you of much larger patterns in society as well, with a greater degree of scientific efficiency than simplistic counting of burial goods. So this is one of the ways in which we are tracking both the individual, but we have placed the individual within their station in life. And naturally, it brings to question the ways in which
Okay, so we've decided while we wait for ma'am, we'd love to know where all our audience has come in from today. So let's get to know each other while we're waiting for ma'am. As we know, all of us are from Miranda House, Delhi University. What about all of you? What sort of colleges and departments are you from? We'd love to know. So if you could just quickly type it in, and the format doesn't allow us to unmute other participants, but we can always have a chat. So if you could just tell us where you're from, what university, what college.
Thank you. Take it I'm audible now. All right, excellent. So I hope then that you heard about our Harappan death, so that we can move on to our next site, which is going to be Mohenjo-Daro. All right, so a lot of objection to what we're talking about today. However, let us get moving. So that's the sort of trope then with which I want us to think about Harappa. That yes, fancy, beautiful, systematized city, lot of inequality, lot of people on whose backs on which the city is being built, and we can clearly see differences in status coming through in health rather than in more superficial sort of ways that we can think of. The next site that we're moving to is Mohenjo-Daro, and this I think is a popular enough example. It's something all of you have seen in your NCERT textbooks. It's also something that some of us have had conversations about in class. The fun thing about Mohenjo-Daro is this idea of invasion, right? It's something that was propagated, and you'll probably see it coming back as well, of the idea of certain groups of people, certain very powerful warriors coming in and wiping everyone off the street. An extremely interesting way to look at data. And I would like to share this quote by George Dales, one of the people who disproved it. I'll read it out for you. Nothing delights the archaeologist more than excavating the ruins from some ancient disaster, be it a flood, an earthquake, invasion, or massacre. This does not reflect any inordinately ghoulish tendency in the character of archaeologists. It is simply that a much more complete picture of life in an ancient site is preserved if the victim dies in this fantastic fun way, rather than the slow natural death of the site. As I keep saying, we need to look at processes. And in Mohenjo-Daro, you get to see something as stark as this. A little trigger warning, if this is disturbing for any of you, please, just minimize the screen, or maybe just go for a few minutes. And if it keeps building on disturbing, do pass on a message to Shivani and she'll let me. But these are the sort of scenes that we're seeing at Mohenjo-Daro, people scattered across the floor. It is very easy to imagine that there are groups that have come in and destroyed them as they stood or as they lived their daily lives. Whilst this is very interesting, it unfortunately is not an excellent way to analyze anything and seems to be quite far away from the truth. The first problem that we have with this entire portrayal that we get to see over here is that these remains post-date the Harappan time. This is after the site was abandoned that some people continue to live here in some manner, we're not really sure, and it is they who have died. None of them bore really fantastic injury marks like the ones we saw from our gentlemen at Harappa, so we know that they weren't really killed as they stood or something like that. They did, of course, die, but that's about all that we can say. There are some offerings which are placed near them, which makes it interesting, right? Is this just some completely different practice of death that we're getting to see? But the most important thing is that nothing seems to be destroyed along with them. So it would have to be some really clear, proper kung fu style killing that just involved lightly murdering everyone and not destroying anything in the civilization at all. So whilst we have a whole lot of very interesting ideas that can come through archaeologically, sadly, we need to painstakingly analyze every little bit that we can to come to more subtle understandings of death at Mohenjo-Daro. And as I said, it's not a site that has been looked into in its entirety in terms of its in terms of these death practices. So we're going to have to wait to really understand what death at Mohenjo-Daro at a particular point in time meant. But just a little rider to be away from these truly exciting ideas that one might think we have. And then we move to Lothal. This is a site that is very close to heart. It's something that I worked on personally, not in terms of excavating. As you can see, the excavation was done a very long time ago when there was no color photography. But within these very simplistic looking burials, there lies this wealth of hidden information, and there lies this beautiful change in death practices that we can actually see. So we see how people's ideas of death are changing, but also how people's ideas of personhood are changing, how this idea of a single person being buried slowly changes with time. As you all know, Lothal, Kalibangan, they're more our side of the border. They're a little bit closer to where we are than Harappa and Mohenjodaro. And we see a number of practices happening. So initially in our first, that is our earliest time period, we see people being buried together, but where you can see a very clear articulation in bones, right? You can clearly tell that there are two people here, there's just one guy here, and that's pretty much it. I use the word guy because as far as the sexing of skeletons is concerned, all the skeletons buried at Lothal have been identified as male. Whilst this is always questionable, it is very, very interesting that they all seem to be male. The only place where we can really put doubt is when we come to burials like this one. Whilst this looks like a single person, there are in fact the mixture of multiple people that we see in this single body. You can see one fully articulated skeleton, but somewhere around his shoulder, there is one bone of an infant, and there are multiple bones of animals, all right? And again, like we saw with Harappa, these are specific bones of animals. So you'll find the teeth, you'll find hooves, you'll find parts of the animal that cannot be eaten. So quite interesting there. Doesn't really make sense as an afterlife offering of food. It's perhaps something else. But these bones are mixed into the bones of this one single individual. It seems then that this single burial does not reflect one man alone. And, you know, these are men between the age group of 18 and 35. Nobody's been marked as older. Nobody's been marked as younger, except for that particular infant. And we have no idea about our animals. So we don't know if they're male or female, and we don't know if what age group they belong to as well. So we begin with this clear, nice articulation and two separate men being buried together. And then we move on to a final stage where parts of other people are mixed into the original single person. This goes to tell us some very particularistic things. On the one hand, of course, these are very dynamic practices of death, right? There is a very significant change happening in the thinking of people in terms of what an individual stands for, in terms of what two individuals stand for. But secondly, also, it's quite interesting that it's just men of a particular age. I'm going to add something even more interesting to this. All the skulls that we have show that they were killed with a single blow, a controlled blow to the left side of the head. So it's not someone who has been to war and, you know, all sorts of alternate, scary, painful injuries. It's a single blow on one side of the head. For Lothal, then, I would like to use the trope of ritual killing, ritual murder that is being done to specific groups in society, all male probably. And in this particular case, then everyone else at the site of Lothal is then not allowed to be buried. We don't really know then if this is a positive thing or this is a negative thing. I think making a separation between the two in the case of a civilization so far away from us in time and space is mistaken. We can't really look at things in terms of black and white. We always look at things in terms of gray. So over here then at Lothal, we see this magnificent practice of burying particular men through time with a little change in the orientation of the body from this highly intimate sort of way of burial, of putting two individuals together, to a space where you can almost not see the other individual because it's so clearly mixed into the bones of the first. So very interesting and significantly different practices of death from our Harappan regular burials, our Harappan ossuary, our Mohenjo-Daro crazy scenes, to our Lothal beautiful burials with controlled ritual death. So this again highlights the variation that we see. Aside with all our men, our 19 to 35-year-olds, we have this little boy as well. It's about 7 to 10. Had a little bit of his skull taken out. It's a practice called trephination. It's done widely across the world. It's done even now. If any of you are interested in getting it done, I'm sure you could. And it's believed to have some sort of medical healing property to it. It doesn't really affect the person. You're unlikely to die because of it. It's a very simplistic process, and it's done very well in the case of this boy. I want you to remember him because we're going to speak about a similar boy from the site of Kalibangan, which is where we're moving on to at this point in time. Kalibangan, we're going to spend the most time with because it is one of the most exciting spaces of death you will ever see. Here, Yes, the practice is singular. You have pots, you have people buried next to pots with pots above their head on pots, as you can see in this particular case. Few grave goods, nothing fancy. In Kalibangan, it is the treatment of the body that becomes very, very exciting for us. And it is only through a very clear reading of the body that we can understand how diverse this site is and how extremely, for lack of a better word, advanced this site is. So we come first to this particular, again, young lady who passed away as a teenager. But the interesting thing about her is that she showed signs of paralysis. She was unable to move most of her body, all right? It's not a wonder, considering the number of people with disabilities, deformities in society, that our burial spaces reflect these people. Our burial spaces have these people. It's absolutely likely that we find people like this. And there's a particular archaeologist named Lorna Tilley who has evolved something called a care understanding mechanism. To what extent are the disabled people of your site taken care of? And how are we able to understand this? Very, very simplistic things. If the face of a person is paralyzed, they are unable to eat regular food, right? So you would feed them special food, softer food, food that is easier to digest. And you will easily be able to see on the teeth if this person has been served different food or has been served the same food that the whole place is eating. Immediately, that gives you one idea of care. And over here, we see that for this particular girl, she possibly could eat quite well. There was nothing exceptional about her teeth. We do know that she was unable to move altogether, and this would make her a prime target for bed sores and really bad infections. It would also make it very easy for her to continuously fall and to have broken bones or, some sort of deformity of the bone from bad healing. This girl showed no signs of that whatsoever. She showed, in fact, a very well-preserved body. And behind these small micro indicators on the bone lies a much larger story. This is not the first disabled person that this particular group has taken care of. They have built off knowledge of multiple generations and developed techniques by which this young lady was taken care of that well. That is the reason why she was able to survive to the age that she could, because if she had been paralyzed for a very long time, she would have been unwilling to eat, unwilling to perform daily activities, as a result of which then she would have died at a much younger age. It also raises some very significant questions about what sort of role this girl would have played in society. It's very easy to be cynical in the modern time and to say that she would have been excluded, not perhaps treated as a full member of society. But when someone comes with this level of physical health, it means a very great level of mental health as well. And it is likely that the community had stretched itself to include her in society. So we need to really think through how much well-preserved bones actually mean, or pristine bones, bones without infection, bones without breakage. We have this other individual who we find as well. The term cripple I'm using, it comes from the archaeologists and the anthropologists who examined him. It's not my own word. But for him, what we see is that he was able to move one of his arms. This would have meant that he would have been able to move from one place to the other by dragging his body along the floor. And that would have shown significant wear marks on other parts of his body, on his arms, on his legs, on his pelvis. All of these spaces would have shown some sort of wear marks. But again, like with our previous girl who we spoke of, we don't see any of these markers. We see again a very well taken care of person, someone who lived a much longer life. And again, this is not knowledge that a single generation is able to accumulate. This is built up over multiple generations to a point where they can care so well for a paralyzed person. Again, I want to stress the fact that this is not merely an indication of the physical health of the person, that they are physically well taken care of. It is a much larger feature of the mental well-being of this person that has been taken care of, the social well-being of this person that has been taken care of. So it is important for us to note these two sorts of points, these two people. So the trope then that I'm trying to introduce with this particular site is one of caregiving, one of taking care of someone who is unable to do so. And whilst these are very, very extreme examples of being unable to care for oneself, we know that at any point of time, all of us go through this, right? Women at certain stages of pregnancy, people who have broken the bones of their legs, people who are unwell. Everybody goes through moments when they reach out and they require a higher level of help. So when we see these, we are looking at extreme examples, but we know that this is a well-functioning society that has evolved mechanisms of care. But then we come to certain examples that jolt us a little bit, that, you know, give us that little nuance that breaks up our idea of care. This particular little boy, and I will remind you of the Lothal boy, again, around the same age, same sort of thing, a little bit of the skull has been taken out, suffered from an affliction called hydrocephalus. It's something very common. It's just where the skull increases because of fluid that is accumulated in the head. With this particular boy, you see that there are bits of the skull which have been taken off at this place, but there are also burning marks that have been applied across his head. There are also spaces where it's not very clear, but he has gotten sort of scratches along the head as well. Perhaps these are mechanisms of care, but perhaps we are also thinking of this again, too much is black and white. Can we think of this as care? Do we stop at intervention? Or do we also start to think of hurtful practices? Maybe practices that emerge from fear, maybe practices that emerge from a form of sadism. We don't really know. But again, it is interesting to consider, and I'll reduce my trope of care now to one of intervention. And this is the same boy that we have within the burial. Then we come to this particular individual who again has certain marks of burning. We know that this person did not, just unfortunately encounter fire in the household, or, that's not some tragic accident, because these are controlled burn marks. So like Lothal, controlled blow to the head, these are controlled burn marks which are only applied to one side of the body. It becomes very interesting then again for us to consider what is the form of care that is being meted out here, or again, do we stop at intervention? Do we think of this as something far more heinous? But again, every single person in this particular burial space has these sorts of intervention, marks of intervention on them. Again, we come to a very interesting person, someone who has been called Lady with a Mirror. When the excavators found a mirror, they thought it was very appropriate to call her Lady with a Mirror rather than, woman plus mirror or something like that. It seemed to be something that added to her personality in their heads. So we go with Lady with a Mirror. She died in a very extraordinary sort of way. It's perhaps the best way to go. She died in her sleep. She was quite cozy. She had her arms placed with each other, and she seems to have actually died within the grave itself. So we can imagine that, maybe people identified her as dying, placed her in the grave, and perhaps stayed with her as she passed away. An interesting thing that happens after she passes away is that they choose to cut off the top of her head. And there, you can see it pretty clearly, right? There's no skull there. We know that this happened after she died because, rigor mortis has set in. She has died peacefully. Again, this raises a really fascinating question as to what sort of intervention this is. Why is this happening? And why is this happening after death? So, and I don't think any of us can really offer answers to this. Like with our massacre thesis, we come on to this fantastic, fascinating case where we have two sharp marks in the bone, and this guy got called murdered man just because of that. It's only these two bones that we're able to find. A lot of these burials have sadly been lost with the flooding that took place at the site. But you see these two clear marks, and there's an understanding that this perhaps relates to someone who was murdered. A question that we can really ask at this point is, why do we only need to think of this trope as murder? Why do we only need to think of this in terms of care or intervention or sadism? Can we think of this as suicide? If we have spoken of physical disabilities within the site, why can't we speak of mental disabilities within the site? So again, we will never have conclusive answers for any of this. But once again, this raises a question as to why these particular people have been buried and buried carefully and with grave goods and whatnot. They don't seem to be excluded per se. Why is this odd hodgepodge of people being buried together and absolutely no one else? And finally, we come to this particular burial number 11. As you can see, it's more or less bones that have been exposed to the elements and then sort of collected and placed within this small urn. Now, this really wouldn't be very significant for us, except for one minor detail. There was some teeth that we found connected together in this particular urn. All of them showed marked signs of less chewing activity. They showed excellent health, but they showed that this person had not chewed as much as another person of the same age in the same site. And this brings us back to that discussion that we had when we were talking about the paralyzed individuals, where we said that food might have specially been prepared for them if they suffered from facial paralysis. It didn't. They had the same teeth as everyone else on site. But in this particular instance, the person seems to have had particularly specially prepared food that was provided to them. And sadly, we only find the teeth, so we don't know who this person was, what affliction they might have had. But all the same, this once again brings us back to this very positive idea of care. So ultimately, what I want you all to get from Kalibangan is that there are no real easy answers, particularly in this case. And just because we are able to see this richness out of Kalibangan does not mean that it does not exist in other Harappan sites. There are clearly very distinct thoughts behind dying, behind death, behind taking care of the living, behind intervening in someone else's distress that we're seeing at each of the sites, right? At Harappa, people don't seem to care for the marginalized versus in a different form of marginalization at Kalibangan, they seem to be extremely well cared for. So again, just to re-emphasize, we don't seem to have any clear sort of way of we don't really seem to have anything homogenizing death practices throughout our Harappan sites. So I really hope you got a flavor of the sort of variation that we see. I'm going to end with Rakhigarhi, and I haven't looked at the skeletal sampling that we get from this site, but I wanted to bring this particular lady to your attention. I'm sure those of you who have been to National Museum have seen her over there. This is the famous Harappan burial from Rakhigarhi that has been displayed since an eternity in National Museum. We don't know where she's going to go now. And it has some fairly controversial writing on it where they have argued that this has to be a woman because she's wearing bangles as married women in the subcontinent do. And, you know, that's always been a controversial sort of idea that we have seen. But I want to end with her because I want us to think about the afterlives of this, that these skeletons have. We've seen them in their sites and as memorialized and as buried by their loved ones, and then they are lifted out and they're placed into these abstract spaces like the National Museum with just one tiny placard, reducing their entire status to perhaps married because of bangles and leaving it at that. And I think we need to then bring in a much higher level of individualization and of being able to see the people behind the skeletal remains. That being said, I think I'm going to end here for today.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such an insightful session. And thank you for introducing us to these skeletal remains that we often read in passing in books, just as a combination of, you know, numbers and letters. But you told us how they constitute a complex of not only biological and social, but also emotional aspects. So thank you for that. And I think I speak for most of us when I say that this webinar has helped us gain such new perspectives and showed us what sort of possibilities can emerge with regard to our understanding of the civilization, its society and its people through the looking glass, that is, of course, the Harappan cemeteries. As I mentioned before, we would like to now open the floor for any kind of questions or comments that our audience may have. So please feel free to type in your comments and questions in the chat box. But to begin with, ma'am, we would like to ask you that death practices is an uncommon field of research, if not unusual. What is it that drew you towards it?
Death is one universal, so I figured I'd always have data. I mean, jokes apart, I think, when I was in my college days, in fact, I got to know a lot of people who had been bereaved at various parts in their lives. And it mattered to me because somewhere I thought studying death in the past could give us a better idea of dealing with it in the present. And sadly, that does not seem to be the case, but it took a while to get there. But as I think death practices are also so fascinating because when we are at that moment of vulnerability, perhaps things which wouldn't come out otherwise tend to come out.
Also, ma'am, I wanted to ask, like, does the placement of cemeteries in terms of the layout of the site, such as Harappa and Kalibangan, give us any insight into the way people might have perceived death?
It's slightly difficult to say. There again seems to be a slight amount of systematization in that the cemeteries are located away from the habitation site. And that would be a sort of obvious thing, I think, for health concerns and otherwise to keep it slightly separate. Whether it reflects their marginalization and death, I would be very, very skeptical about.
All right, thank you, ma'am. We have a question from one of our faculty, Snigdha ma'am. While you were talking about Kalibangan, ma'am asked if we have any idea of the age group.
The age group. For Kalibangan, yes, the aging was done by people from the Anthropological Survey of India. We got to know the ages for most people. So, for example, for lady with a mirror, once again with the term lady, they assumed she was, I think, over 30, roughly, because beyond a point, after 35, it's a little difficult to identify, particularly since this was excavated in the 1960s, studied in the 1990s, and the preservation of the bones has always been rather suspect. There is also the thing that for the most part, these bones will no longer be found because they were washed away in a flood or have been destroyed in other ways. For our child, he was put in between 7 and 10 years of age. So essentially prepubescent, he was put in that age group. For the cripple, again, he was put at about an age just before 30, just under 30. So well and truly in the adult realm. And for her, she was put in towards the end of the teenage years, so closer to 19.
My apologies, ma'am.
Oops.
Ma'am has asked this question with regard to the skeletal where we talked about the teeth, and this.
Oh, now, if you looked at the teeth, you'd definitely be able to tell the age of the person, but in those days that was not done. So they were really unable to say anything except for the fact that they were markedly less square. But on average, they were identified as adult teeth.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, the next question is coming from Radhika ma'am. She wishes to ask, could the several bodies in the Lothal cemeteries indicating disability and care allow us to imagine a caregiving facility, a hospital, or rehabilitation home? If so, what would it indicate about the complexity of the society?
Wow, I think that's a fascinating question. If there was some sort of non-residential space where we found a different class of artifacts, so artifacts that are not found in any of the other spaces, then yes, I think we would be able to say perhaps that there is a special space where care is being administered. But that doesn't seem to be the case on site. It seems to be a fairly normal Harappan sites. Again, this was excavated in the 70s, the 60s and the 70s. So it can also be that they weren't that aware of these particular tropes. This, of course, is in the case of Kalibangan. Aside from that, I would like to argue that these sort of practices, the ability to care for a person to such a high level, cannot happen over a single generation. It involves a whole lot of experimentation to understand exactly what practices are beneficial to the person and what are detrimental, what are the really scary things that can happen from being entirely paralyzed. So I would then argue that this is a reflection of multiple generations having gone through these caregiving mechanisms, and then we are just able to see a reflection of that in the few people buried at the site. So we just have about 33 burials coming out of Kalibangan.
Thank you, ma'am. I actually had a similar question, which was that when we were talking about Lothal, we talked about the skeletal remain of a younger boy, whose a fraction of whose skull was removed intentionally. Or pointers towards the logistics team is going haywire. So does that point us towards, the presence of some sort of medical person? I think saying doctor would be a very long stretch.
And for one thing, this sort of activity, I don't see it as being the realm of one single person, right? This would require a team. It's still pretty painful, even though it's not particularly life-threatening. Yes, obviously there is a certain level of specialization to ensure that they're just getting that little fragment out and like, oops, we got to the brain. Things like that are not happening. So yes, there would be some sort of specialization. I dislike these tropes of medicine and surgery being added to it, because these are very couched in modern terms. And like I said, we don't really know if this is care, if this is intervention, if this is sadism, if this is ritual, and if it's just a combination of all four of them.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. Ritu, could you please take the next question from the chat box?
Sure. So the next question has been asked by Nayanashri Kalita. Ma'am, she wishes to ask, once a skeleton is studied by one person, can't it be investigated by another in future?
Absolutely. So all skeletal remains are either kept with the Anthropological Survey of India. In some cases, they're kept at the site itself in the site museum with the Archaeological Survey of India. They're always available for scholars to study at a later time, so long as the institution preserves them. And it is very important to go back to these skeletal collections and try to study them. There are certain problems that come up. So, for example, where the solution of polyvinyl acetate is normally put to keep it together so it doesn't crumble when you try and move it out of its context, it becomes difficult to really engage with the skeleton then. But scholars are still able to do that. Anthropologists are able to do that. And, Harappa has been excavated so many times in the past, people keep going back to the bones to study them. So it's standard practice as well.
Thank you, ma'am.
All right, thank you for that question entry. Our next question is from Himani. It reads, was there any pattern followed with the treatment of burials of different genders? And she also says, thank you so much for this enlightening lecture.
All right, so for the different genders, it's really interesting, right? When we study the skeleton, we're saying either mostly male or mostly female, right? We're not trying to be absolute about it. We're doing a physical examination. So there is a scope for subjectivity to come in. It's not an entirely, foolproof process. Sometimes you're only finding remains like the feet, for example, and then you'll say that, okay, these are large feet, must be man. So in some ways, these sorts of generalizations are also being made. So we have to be a little bit nuanced when we're trying to think through how whether there is any pattern when it comes to the genders. Have we identified, have we sexed the skeletons correctly to begin with? At most sites, there does not seem to be a difference in the treatment of men and women. There seems to be some other factor, or male and female, there seems to be some other factor that is accounting for differences in burial practices. It does not seem to be gender-based. But as you saw with Lothal, we don't seem to find any remains of any females, unless the animals whose bones are mixed in, they could have been female, or that particular infant. But aside from that, we don't seem to have any evidence of women being buried at Lothal or females being buried.
Thank you, ma'am, for such a detailed explanation. The next question is by Anushka Parekh. She says, can the marks of a violent attack on bone remains be taken suggest a generalized lack of law and order in Harappan site? Also, can this be stretched to understand the pattern of physical abuse against certain classes?
So when we are saying, so that there are two things in that. When you have some evidence of violence, as we're seeing, it's not an excessive amount at, the other sites at Lothal, at Kalibangan, for example. We just got the one example of the murdered man, and we don't seem to be getting too much of violence leading to death. The argument in the case of Harappa is that people in the Ossuary area, people who seem to be marginalized, are more likely to show evidence of violent death than people in other parts of the Harappan cemeteries. So this is not to suggest that this is that it is just one group that is suffering all the violence. You see violence in different places. I don't know how far one would take this in terms of understandings of law and order. It still seems to be a very limited practice. Violent deaths still seems to be quite limited. And again, it varies from site to site, right? At Lothal, where it is a controlled blow, it's unlikely to be a sudden violent action by a certain group. This is something that seems to have the legitimacy of a whole lot of people if it can be done so clearly, and then they can be buried in a particular way, and there's a particular group that is being targeted. It's not a prevalent practice.
Thank you, ma'am. Anushka, I hope that helped you understand a little better. Ma'am, could you tell us what would signify or pass for a cemetery in terms of the type of burials, the number of burials in terms of Harappan civilization? Because our present understanding of cemeteries is quite different. So what would pass for a cemetery?
I think Harappan cemeteries are quite clearly identifiable in that case, because you will find multiple people there. So at minimum, like at Lothal, you're finding 19 people. They're not all at the same level. There's some who are buried much lower than the others. So there seem to be three very distinct levels at Lothal. But generally, it's an easily identifiable space because there's no remains over there, right? No structural remains, nothing. It is just a bunch of people who are buried together over there, and that's it. That's how you would identify the cemetery. But I think your question comes to a large extent from Mohenjo-Daro, where it's a big mess, and we don't seem to have a separate area where people are being buried, right? It seems more like they have died over there, and then offerings are being made. In retrospect, I think it's all right to argue for those spaces being cemeteries as well.
Thank you, ma'am. Also, ma'am, it would be great if we could share your views on the controversy around the post-cremation urns that have been found at sites like Harappa and Mohenjodaro.
Okay, I'm not entirely sure of what the controversy is. You do find urn burials throughout the Harappan, the Indus Valley civilization. In fact, at Surkotada, you would only find urns with, not cremated remains, but exposed remains. So again, this is just one of the many practices of death that we're seeing throughout the Indus Valley civilization. And as I have said, we're still just seeing a fragment, right? This is 33 people in a site that's been occupied for about 2,000 years. It's obviously not reflective of everyone in the site. So we're looking still at somewhat niche practices.
Just in addition to Ritu's question, I think the controversy is more in, from the little that we've read, is more in terms of, for example, at Mohenjo-Daro, there have been burial urns that have been found, but then they lack bone remains. But they've then also been placed near the foundation of the Great Bath. So, I mean, does it tell us that did it have to do, then, it kind of tells us that it had to do with something important or an important person if it was a burial urn at all. So what are your thoughts about that?
I mean, how are we identifying it as a burial urn at all if there are no skeletal remains in it? I think it's because of the similar nature of the pottery that one tends to identify. These ideas don't have to be static, right? The person is viewed in the space of death as one. It can be viewed very distinctly in this space of the living as another. So, I mean, again, I don't have enough information to really comment on it, but what I can tell you is that Kalibangan, you find some graves where there are only pots and there are no skeletal remains whatsoever. It's in the cemetery area, and we know that this is exposed exposed to the elements for a very long time, because you have you have layer by layer accumulating of mud on those pots, and they're ultimately never buried. So some archaeologists argue that this is symbolic burial. The person passed away from home and was unable to be brought back. But again, I think that's simplifying to a large extent and really using the experiences of another culture, sort of hegemonizing on Harappa. When we don't know, we just don't know.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, once again, another question is coming from Radhika ma'am. Ma'am, she's asking, does burial at 3 distinct levels indicate graves over a long time period? Have the levels been dated? What span of time are we talking about?
So the burials themselves were never dated. There was no space to really collect carbon from those sorts of areas, because it's an exclusive burial space. And again, these have been excavated in the 70s, and this was not a concern. The way in which the dating has been done is on the basis of the pottery that is found, because all of them have some, as we saw in the picture, some form or some small amount of pottery. So the lowest layer has been associated with the early Harappan, and then you have a middle mature Harappan, then you have one slightly higher above that. Another interesting feature of Lothal, where we're able to see these 3 levels coming up with the burials, is also that people are revisiting certain spaces. So in this entire large area, there are only spots where people come, after certain spans in time. Roughly, it's taken to reflect, I think, about 1500 years. But again, that's more a generalized idea than a particularistic carbon dated idea of the time.
Thank you, ma'am. Our next question is coming from, please pardon me if I'm not pronouncing it correct, Eva. She says, I'm curious about the child with hydrocephalus. What was it the surgery that killed him, as I do not really think that the level of surgery back then would be that advanced that the child would survive without any abnormality? Did he die right after the surgery, or did he survive? Do we have any data or information about this? Thank you, ma'am.
That's a lovely question. We have a little bit of data to suggest that he survived for a little while after this was done, because the space of the skull seemed to sort of heal slightly, not to a very large extent. So we know that he was able to survive, but we don't know what the impact of the hydrocephalus was, because hydrocephalus itself has multiple results. So in some cases, it just looks very, very horrifying, but doesn't actually impact in any way. In some cases, it could go so far as to cause a developmental disability. So we are really unable to tell what exactly killed him, but it does not appear to be that, just the pulling out of the bit of the skull and the applying of the burn marks have, killed him.
Thank you, ma'am. I hope it cleared all your doubts, Eva. Another question, ma'am, I would like to ask you. A burial found at Rakhigarhi, which contained the skeleton remain of a man and a woman, have popularly been termed as the first Harappan couple. Could you give us more accurate insight as to whether this could have been intentional, or was it just another double burial?
Every burial is intentional. There's a reason why the 2 people are being buried together. To call it the first Harappan couple does seem a little bit strange, but again, double burials is not a major feature of the Harappan space. It's something that you're seeing to a large extent at Lothal. It'll mean something drastically different at Rakhigarhi. So up till we don't, and Rakhigarhi is a huge site, there's so many burials that have been found. Up till we don't contextualize and try and understand it for that site, I don't think we can really say much about it.
All right, thank you, ma'am. It's a very popular, as history students, we know better, but otherwise we've actually heard this to the extent that we read an article that even called them the first married couple. So that was a long way to go. Ma'am, there's another question. Why do you think there is a tendency among scholars or historians to, try and trace a normative style of interment in Harappan cemeteries? And do you think, is it the binaries of present times that has led to the initial rejection of a possibility of multifarious burial traditions?
Sorry, that was two large questions. Could you just repeat the first part again? I didn't understand.
Definitely, ma'am. I may have gone too fast. I'm sorry.
Not at all.
Why do you think there is a tendency among scholars or historians to trace a normative style of interment in Harappan cemeteries? Do you think that the binaries of present times have sort of influenced and led to the initial rejection of a possibility of multifarious burial traditions?
Absolutely right in that regard. It seems that for far too long, where we've tracked our understanding of any civilization with very, very, very contemporary ideas. And it's been a little difficult to move out of those spaces. The basis of the culture concept, Harappan or otherwise, has always been to focus on similarities, which is why certain scholars might have, particularly in the past, wanted to push these very singular ideas of death as well. And it sort of follows the logic of the argument that if you are seeing it in other spheres of life, you should be able to see it in death as well. This focus on variation is something that comes up very recently, sort of similar to the way in which it happens in history when you have a sort of postmodernist approach that is coming in, which is saying that let's think about variability not as something to be pushed to the back burner, but really to be brought to the fore. And all of this data, as you can see, has been available publicly since the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s. It's always been publicly available, and yet you don't see enough focus on being able to pull out this sort of mortuary variability. You haven't had enough scholars studying death in Harappa for whatever reason. One of the ways, if I can just, sort of add on, one of the ways in which we've really suffered in terms of contemporary perceptions, I think has been in terms of gender. So if you see this entire bangle wearing must be married has been a very, very popular idea with the whole Harappan setup, whether it is at National Museum, whether it is elsewhere. There seems to be a slight truth to the argument, not in terms of marriage, but in terms of women exclusively wearing bangles and men not wearing bangles. But what is all the more problematic is other ideas that seem to have seeped in, ideas that because we found a mirror, this is a lady interested in fashions, as women are interested in fashions. There are other ideas that were put in, like, wine goblets, something which we have no evidence of wine being in it at all. It's just a goblet. Wine goblets being found with men and not with women. So, it is very, very easy for contemporary ideas to have a stranglehold on our views of death, and very important to be critical about all of these ideas.
Wow, that was very interesting. Ma'am, next, Aparnadi, thanking you for this very interesting session, wishes to ask you some books which will help us to explore the topic further.
There is a lot of, there isn't that much that's coming out in books. A few have been sent to Shivani, and as you'll see, they contain very small write-ups on burials. They have very, very homogenized understanding of burials throughout the civilization. So you would actually have to start looking at it from a site-by-site sort of perspective. And I would very much recommend the work of a scholar named Gwen Robbins-Shug, and she's primarily worked on Harappa, but very, very good insights. And the first part of my talk focused on one of her papers. So I'm just going to put down her name in the chat box, and you could look up work by her.
Thank you, ma'am. Also, ma'am, I wanted to ask, like, what aspect of death practices at Harappa intrigues you the most?
For me, it's always been about identifying individuals. It doesn't work for me for us to think of, large spaces with a lot of people just buried willy-nilly, or to make very simplistic arguments about a lot of artifacts being found with one person as opposed to another, and saying that these are high status burials. Harappan burials on the whole don't really appear to be supremely interesting because they have the same few things with them always. The more you move away from Harappa, you'll find even fewer grave goods. So grave goods is not a great way to really study Harappa. So for me, wherever you're finding well-articulated bodies is a very interesting space to study. So the body then in the grave as opposed to everything around it or in it is most interesting facet for me.
Thank you, ma'am. There is another question that has to do with post-cremation urns. It says that the post-cremation urns at Harappa and then the pot burial cenotaphs at Kalibangan seem to have similar characteristics. Do you think there could be any relation with them? I think the confusion also arises because they've been named different things, but their characteristics list the same. So
I mean, the characteristics obviously would be quite similar. They're pots of a particular shape. There's not a phenomenal amount of variation. And they're your average red ware, right? They're not to a large extent like your beautiful cemetery H, thickly illustrated Harappan ware. But it could be one of two things. I don't think we have enough evidence to indicate either one. It could be that communities are speaking, exchanging ideas, and these ideas have spread between two sides. But what is more like, at least what I think is more likely is that contextually they mean very, very different things. Because as I said, the Kalibangan pots, they're exposed to the elements, they're not buried for the longest time. And they almost seem to, they don't seem to be a burial in waiting. They seem to be representative of something. So, whether it is people whose bodies could not be placed over there or whether the pot then stands for the person, is something that sadly we can just hypothesize about. There's nothing we can say for certain.
Thank you, ma'am. Last question I would like to ask you, ma'am. What, according to you, is the next most important question with regard to death practices within the Harappan civilization that scholars should seek to answer to?
I think it's very important that we start looking at the body, which as you can see, a lot of scholars have started doing, right? Understanding every minor fragment of the body that we're finding, and also then to sort of have a very, very micro analysis of everything that is being found, to have a detailed analysis, and then allowing each side to build up its own narrative rather than sort of jamming one narrative on all of them. But I do think the focus, as long as the focus is the body, we are probably going to be able to tell a lot more about Harappan death practices than if we focus on other elements of the burial.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for this insightful session. I think I speak for most of us when I say that this webinar has helped us to give a new perspective and show us what sort of possibilities can emerge with regard to our understanding of the civilization, its society, and its people through the looking glass that is the Harappan Cemeteries.
Facing so many network issues. I think Ritu lost her network connection, but basically we have almost come to the end of that, not the exact end. Firstly, thank you, Joeeta ma'am, for hosting this webinar for us. You had so much fun in your classes, and this webinar was even more insightful. I would like to express my gratitude to all the volunteers for all the work that they have put in to make this webinar successful. I would also like to thank my graphic and content heads and also our entire team for always being so cooperative. Of course, this entire venture would not have happened if not I'm really sorry about that intervention. I just wanted to say that, of course, this entire venture would not have happened if not for the constant support and guidance of our professors. Here's a big virtual thank you to our audience as well for being so energetic throughout the webinar. And Joeeta ma'am, please keep on checking your inbox. It won't be me troubling you with questions this time. We have a small surprise, so please do keep on checking it in the coming days. And before we end this webinar, here's a little something that Zainab, on behalf of a society, has made. Zainab, can you please present the video? Zainab or Ritu?
कैसे कहे क्या है सितम सोचता है अब ये हम कोई कैसे कहे वो है या नहीं हमारे पास है फिर भी पास नहीं हमको एक हमराज नहीं शीश के एक दीवार है जैसे दरमियां.
Thank you, Zainab, and thank you, Ritu, for presenting the video.
Am I audible?
Yes, Shivan, go ahead.
That was amazing, Zainab. You always manage to keep us in awe. Joeeta ma'am, would you like to say a few words about this experience?
Yeah, I was actually just typing it. Thank you so much. That was, as always, very, very sweet and so beautifully done by all of you. I mean, your video works, as always, keep frightening me to new levels because it's just so fantastic. It's a scary power to have, and we should find ways to curb it. But thank you so much, all of you. I'm sorry, I don't think the talk was the best today, but all the same, I'm so glad that I got to share some of my work with you. I think I complain more than enough in class saying that I wish I could tell you more interesting things. So I hope we can keep this conversation going. Thank you so much, all of you, the Raahi team. I'm so happy to see Mumtaz for a while because this was all her idea right from last year. So it's an absolute privilege as always to be able to chat with all of you.
Thank you so much, Nila ma'am. I'm really glad that you felt that way. The pleasure is all ours. Anyone, if you have any comments that you would like to share, please do let us know. And like, we're terribly sorry about all the network glitches that happened. If you have anything to say about how the webinar went, please put them in the chat box. And before you go, just a little bit of self-promotion. Please do follow our social media handles. We'll put the links in the chat box. I think finally they have come to the actual end of our webinar. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. It was a delight to host all of you, and we expect to host you in the future as well. So have a good evening or a night, everyone, and do stay safe. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us and bearing with our multiple network issues. We will now be going. And since this was our first webinar, we hope to see you super soon again. Stay tuned and thank you.